Cliff Fields, Governor of Unlicensed Boxing.
What have you been doing today up until this point?
Got her at 1 for the weigh-in. Went back to the hotel, had a nice steak, mushrooms, chips and things, you know, a few chips.
Known as one of the toughest men in Britain in the 1970s and 1980s, ex-professional heavyweight boxer who even shared the ring with the greatest Muhammad Ali. Cliff was certainly tough. Even legendary fighter Lenny McLean, whilst out together on nights with Cliff, would rip his shirt off, show his muscles and shout, "I'm the hardest man in London," and then point over to Cliff and say, "Apart from him." And Lenny had good reason to say this, because Cliff had beaten Lenny twice in unlicensed fights, both by stoppage as well. So coming up next is my friend Bill Cooper, who was a lifelong friend of Cliff Fields. Bill was in the corner for Cliff when he fought Lenny both times. Here's Bill talking about one of those fights.
You get away with the odd headbutt and that. Yeah, Lenny came out in the first round and just steamed into Cliff, left and right, very fast hands. Cliff just covered up and took him for about a minute, and then he started opening up himself with right hands. He looked a bit shocked when he started taking them, and after 2 minutes, one of Lenny's cornermen rang the bell and stopped the boat early. Had a big row about that, but we settled down and come out for the second round, and Lenny steamed in again. Cliff battered him back, and Lenny nutted Cliff. Cliff turned him on the ropes and head-butted him back and kneed him in the nuts, and then hit him with about half a dozen good right hands and knocked him out. They dragged him over to our corner and just rolled him out of the ring. Picture of that in Islington Gazette.
So Bill, being friends with Cliff all those years, actually married Cliff's auntie Maureen, and they drank together, they sparred together, went to fights together. Even though Cliff and Lenny McLean had their 2 fights, they actually became quite good friends, and Cliff stayed at Lenny's house. Lenny gave him a suit to borrow, and they actually done debt collecting jobs together. And Cliff said Lenny didn't really need me because he was so intimidating by himself. But Cliff really got on with Lenny's kids, Jamie and Kelly, and he really liked Val as well. Yeah, even though they were friends, they had a fallout once in Kenny Mack's yard where Lenny used to do a lot of sparring. And Lenny was sparring Cliff down there one day, and something happened, the sparring maybe went out of control. Lenny picked up a piece of wood and whacked Cliff over the head with it. So going back to the beginning, Cliff was born in June 1943 in Luton in St Mary's Hospital. He was the first of his 3 siblings, Roger and then Jean, following on 4 years apart from each other. They lived with their mum and dad, Len and Kit. So Cliff followed in his dad's footsteps, not only with the boxing, but he also joined the Royal Navy, serving on HMS Ark Royal. So in his boxing, Cliff had already started to show a toughness and a power of punch that would go on in later years to see him dominate the unlicensed scene and get to the Southern Area champion as a professional, with people like Roy Shaw, Charles Bronson, the Richardson brothers from London, all saying that Cliff was the toughest unlicensed fighter of all. Roy Shaw would even go as far to say as he would never have even dreamt of fighting Cliff, because Cliff was too big, too strong, too good, where Roy was a natural middleweight at 5'8", 5'9". He said Cliff was a giant of a man. Ray Hill, who's got a very good channel, also knew Cliff at the same time when Cliff was boxing unlicensed. Ray Hill did a lot of jobs with Cliff, debt collecting jobs and minding type work. And Ray Hill said the same. Cliff was the governor. He was the toughest unlicensed fighter. Charlie Bronson, on one of his very rare spells of freedom, bumped into Cliff in a pub in Luton, and Charlie Bronson said he was honoured to meet Cliff himself, sit down with Cliff, and Cliff gave him a little bit of advice, because Charlie had an upcoming fight, the famous fight where you see Charlie in the ring and the gun drops on the floor, and he said Cliff gave him some advice, and they became friends, lifelong friends. So Cliff was doing well in the amateurs, boxing for the Royal Navy. He did lose 3 in a row at one point, 2 to Mick Jewson and 1 to the Irish champ Tony Brogan. And Cliff said he felt like he was fighting men sometimes because of the size difference. Sometimes Cliff would be 196 pound and he'd be fighting men weighing 210 pound. So in 1965, Cliff got to the ABA quarterfinals with the Navy. His hard hitting, his power shots had seen him stop a phenomenal 30 opponents in the first round. And his tough chin had made him an opponent that most amateurs did not want to fight. So with a lack of amateur opponents, Cliff decided to turn professional so they would get some fights. But to leave the Navy caused a few problems for Cliff. The Navy wouldn't release him, so he had an ongoing battle with the Navy to try and get released to pursue a boxing career, which ended actually in Cliff hitting an officer and spending time in the glass house. Eventually they did release him in 1968, and Cliff had his first professional fight. So Cliff beat Rocky Davis, his first opponent, in 73 seconds, and then along with his new manager Burt McCarthy started working his way up the pro ranks. He was sparring top pros at that time, Brian London and Joe Bugner, and my friend and well-known face Manny Clark was actually around at the time and watched a lot of the sparring as a kid with his brother Lance. So as Cliff was making his way up through the pro ranks, he would still do door work and he would do the occasional debt job, and he would also work with Charlie and Eddie Richardson down in London, working on scrapyards in Dunstable. He'd work on the Richardson scrapyard and he would do other work for the Richardson brothers as well. Cliff went over to Canada in 1970 and married Marie. They came back, lived together in Dunstable, and at that time Cliff had now won 9 out of 9 professional fights, all by stoppage. And it was now that he's lost his first fights. He lost a fight on cuts to Brian Jewett, and then he lost the following fight on cuts to Billy Aird. Billy Aird was a good boxer and was referee at some of my fights when I was pro in the early 2000s. So Cliff was susceptible to cuts. So Cliff had a rematch with Billy Aird and he lost again on cuts, I think in round 7. And it was around this time that he was invited to spar legendary fighter and the greatest of all time, Muhammad Ali, along with some other top boxers including Johnny Frankham. And Johnny Frankham had a lot of love for Cliff and vice versa. Cliff actually said, "I've got that much love for Johnny Frankham that I would die for him." And the feeling was reciprocated, with Johnny always saying how much he loved Cliff, and he was one of the toughest unlicensed fighters. So Cliff came back from the cuts losses with 2 wins, and the British Boxing Board of Control were then considering to take away Cliff's licence due to this issue with cuts. Cliff had never been down, never got floored, didn't get rocked. He just got cut and stopped via the cuts. So he had another fight lined up with Richard Dunn. Richard Dunn had put up a brave performance against Muhammad Ali, losing after 5 rounds. So they lined up Cliff with Richard Dunn. Same thing happened again. Cliff lost on cuts, and effectively that was the end of his professional boxing career, which was a real shame, because to have so much potential to then have it ruined by cuts was devastating. So now without a boxing licence, Cliff started up a haulage company and he carried on with the door work and the debt collecting jobs and minding and stuff like that. The door work was problematic. He was attacked one night by a man and in self-defence punched the man. The man ended up in a coma with serious injuries. So Cliff was then taken to Wormwood Scrubs, where he was obviously worried that he might be getting done for manslaughter, and got into a few fights in Wormwood Scrubs, knocked a couple of people out, and luckily the man regained consciousness from a coma. So the charge was dropped down to GBH, and Cliff served, I think, 18 months. And upon his release from Wormwood Scrubs, he saw that Frank Warren had started up an unlicensed boxing company. So Cliff straight away said, I want part of that. And he got a message to Frank Warren that he wanted to fight on these new shows, unlicensed.
Cliff Fields, he's another one. Had it hard all his life. He won the ABA championship when he was in the Navy. He left the Navy, turned professional, he won the Southern Area title. Had a few fights, he started getting knocked to the being used, as they all are, as lumps of meat. And then his licence was cancelled. They withheld his licence apparently because he cut easy. Yeah, he got a lot of cuts.
So Cliff went down to watch these unlicensed shows. His first fight was lined up to be Lenny McLean, who at that time had made a big name for himself by beating the previous governor, Roy Shaw. They'd had 2 fights. Roy won the first, Lenny won the second. So now Lenny was the governor and he was the big name on the unlicensed scene. So Cliff travelled down to watch Lenny fight Solly Francis. Solly Francis had been stabbed a few nights previously. I think he was doing door work and he'd been stabbed. But Lenny took him out in the first round, and Cliff was ringside shouting at Lenny, giving him a bit of stick and challenging him from ringside. So the fight was then set up between Cliff and Lenny. Lenny didn't actually realise who Cliff was, but the promoters did, and the promoters then made sure that the rubber match between Roy Shaw was set up. So the third fight between Lenny and Roy was going to be first before Cliff. And in fact, Cliff Fields was going to be the referee, and he was the referee. You can see him in the big white shirt trying to pull him apart. He towers over him, he's huge. Cliff was going to fight the winner. So Cliff's fight with Lenny was billed as the unofficial heavyweight championship of Great Britain. And they got in, and as Bill Cooper said, they had a tear up in the beginning, headbutts were thrown, kicks, knees to the privates, and Cliff ended up knocking Lenny out. So a rematch was set. So all respect to Lenny for not only fighting an ex-professional boxer, with Lenny having no real boxing background, but respect to Lenny for accepting to have a rematch with a man who knocked him out. Not many people want a rematch with someone who's knocked him out, so you've got to give Lenny credit for that. Rematch was set for 1979, and Cliff once again won that fight in the 4th round. This time Lenny put up a lot better performance, landing a few jabs, keeping Cliff off, making it quite an even contest until I think the 4th round, where Cliff caught Lenny with some body shots and then followed up with some headshots and took Lenny out once again with a stoppage win. Now, the only fight I know that Cliff was ever filmed, or there's any footage left of, is the fight against Ron Redrup, which was in the documentary Box On, which Frank Warren commissioned, I think. And Ron Redrup was 44 at the time, but apparently he was a very good amateur, and Cliff beat him fairly convincingly. There's a big size difference. But that was that Box On was going to showcase Lenny. Cliff was fairly quiet compared to Lenny, so Box On was there to sort of promote Frank Warren's unlicensed fight. Yeah, luckily we get to see Cliff fight, and you can see how strong he is going forward, and just a big man, very, very powerful, and doesn't worry about getting hit. His defence wasn't his forte. He just could take a good punch. Ray Hill talks about it a lot. He was there at some of the fights, and that punch of power and a solid chin makes you a very tough person to beat, especially if you're fit. Cliff then had a fight with Shaka, and to everyone watching, they said Cliff won on points. But as the ref went to give the decision, apparently Frank Warren signalled the ref to give the decision to Shaka. And Cliff had a lifelong hatred of Frank Warren because of this. He felt it very unjust and very unfair. And Cliff then had a bit of time out. I think he came back and won one more fight. But sadly, he got involved whilst on the door in a street fight with a gang, and a broken bottle was put in his eye. He lost his eyesight. Sadly, then he couldn't box anymore. So boxing was his life, door work was his life. Sadly, he went downhill, deteriorated, and yeah, that was the start of the decline of Cliff. So Cliff Fields will always be remembered as a quiet man, a humble man, respected and loved. A huge man with a huge punch and a huge heart, and a legendary fighter from Dunstable. I was lucky enough to meet Cliff on a couple of occasions towards the end of his life. Many thanks to Red Menzies and Bill Cooper and Tate. We went over to see him a couple of times. One of the times he was good, another time he wasn't so well. But I got to meet him, got some pictures with him, and got to meet a legend. And I was also lucky enough to be part of his book, to write a couple of bits for his book, and I took a few of the photos for Cliff's book, which is called A Cut Above the Rest. So many thanks to Paul Knight and Jamie O'Keefe for being part of that. And if anybody wants the book, you can find it. It's very expensive now because it's obviously limited edition. Very, very hard to find, but if you do find it, it goes from about 300 quid onwards, I think. But yeah, it's a good tribute to a top fighter and a legend. I think there's also a new book in the pipeline. I think David Fields, Cliff's son, possibly might be doing a new book. Just want to give a shout out to David Fields as well, and to the Cliff Fields Appreciation Society on Facebook. Big shout out to everyone on there as well. It's a really good Facebook page with loads of pictures and stuff. Anybody wants to look at that as well. I just want to say thank you everyone for watching. Thank you to all my subscribers. I'm so amazed at how many new subscribers are joining, and thank you to all my old subscribers for staying with me and watching the content, and all your likes, shares and comments. Please leave a comment on the video as well. And yeah, I'm really grateful to everybody. So yeah, I hope you all have a good day, and I'll see you all soon. Thank you.